Hi, everyone. Just wanted to start off our next presentation on NGOs and Change by giving a quick shout out to the winner of our UNESCO World Heritage Challenge. That was Jocelyn. Jocelyn, very good job identifying that in fact was Drottningholm Castle in Sweden. I visited there back in 2015, I'm going to say 2014, 2015. I was actually in Sweden for a friend's wedding, and we spent about a week after the wedding outside of Stockholm, and that was one of the many sites that we went to visit. I will say one of the more unusual stops that we did in Stockholm was not Drottningholm, but rather a shrimp and taco boat tour that we took that were filled with older German women. I don't know, it was us and then about 50 old German women. And we just went around the various canals and lakes and I guess not lakes, but fjords and all that area of Sweden and Stockholm. So it was quite eventful. And it's a lovely place. If you ever have the opportunity to visit Stockholm and Sweden, it's a really special country and wonderful people. So it was a great trip and one that brings me a lot of pleasure and joy. So I will be posting a new UNESCO World Heritage Site picture on Wednesday. Just as a reminder, because I didn't mention this the first time, but try not to use any sort of Google search function to guess. Rather, use your best intuition and assumptions about where I may have traveled, and try to, maybe use the UNESCO World Heritage Site a little bit to snoop around to come to a conclusion. No harm in guessing the wrong answer. I also want to give a shout out to Felipe and Alessandra, who both posted pictures of them at the World Heritage Sites. That was really wonderful. I loved reading about those sites and seeing the pictures of you all there. So that was great. I wanted to, rather than just jumping straight into the lecture and presentation for today, I wanted to take a minute or two to kind of joke around like I try to do at the beginning of class a little bit. A couple of things. Obviously, right now, everybody's looking for recommendations for what they can stream or what they can binge watch or things like that, or what they can do while they're quarantined and staying inside. A couple of shows that I've been watching. One, Broadchurch, which is a British crime drama that is on Netflix. It's outstanding. It stars Olivia Colman, who is a great actress who some of you may have seen her a few years ago. She won the Academy Award for a movie called The Favorite that also had Emma Stone and Rachel Weisz in it. Anyway, so Olivia Colman's in it, and then David Tennant, who was Doctor Who for a very long time. I don't know if any of you are big Doctor Who fans, but anyway, David Tennant and Olivia Colman are in it. It's about 3 seasons. It's a pretty quick binge watch. It's shot beautifully. It makes you want to move to England. It's just a beautifully shot film and series. So check that out. Narcos Mexico season 2, outstanding. Great stuff there. It is a fun show that I watch, but it's about a serious subject matter and one that has affected, I'm sure, many of you and your families in some way, especially if you've come from Texas or Mexico. The drug cartel trade has had a huge influence on all of us. And my brief time living in El Paso back in 2007, 2008, that was, just kind of seeing things up close and personal. But I know some of you grew up in different parts of Mexico or different parts of Texas closer to the border, and that's a very real way of life. And I think the show demonstrates both the glamorous and very unglamorous sides of this for all involved. And so, good show there. And then the final one that I'm just getting into, it's season 2 I'm watching right now. I already did season 1, a show called Babylon Berlin. If any of you are into period pieces, or if you're into like crime noir, kind of that kind of dramatic crime show. So it's set in Berlin in the late 1920s. and it's about a detective and series of cases. It's really, really good. So those are my three recommendations: Broadchurch, Narcos Mexico season 2, and Babylon Berlin. Check them out if you have the chance or if you're interested. The other thing I wanted to update you all about is I've gotten good at something, and if it works out well, if this whole teaching thing doesn't end up working out, or I end up leaving St. Edward's for which I hope never happens, but for some reason I go into something on my own, I have gotten good at making breakfast tacos. I've gotten quite good at it. In fact, I'm not up to kind of Veracruz or Torchy's yet, but I'm getting there. So my wife has encouraged me to think about getting a taco truck, one of the 8,000 million taco trucks that are in Austin. But I have gotten very good at making breakfast tacos. Right now, because my wife's vegetarian, it's a very limited menu, basically migas and potato, egg, and cheese. That's what I got going on. But if you're interested in either of those, man, am I good at that. So I hope to hear some recommendations from you. I'll post an announcement on the course page where you can reply to that and give me your recommendations for shows that you're watching or films that you've seen or good books that you're reading, actually. My wife's actually downstairs right now reading Michelle Obama's book, and she's really enjoying that. So whatever your recommendations are, I look forward to hearing them. And then I want to hear about what you've gotten good at over break. Perhaps a skill you've been able to hone, or something that you've never done before that you've had to start doing and you've actually found some joy in involved in that process. So always try to find the good and the silver lining around these challenging times. So with all of that said, I wanted to move on to what we're going to focus on today, which is NGOs and change, and really how these smaller organizations can make a substantial difference. Okay. So when we think about NGOs, it's really important to see just how massive this sector has become, and it's really become this large over the last 30 years, really starting in the 1970s. You start to see this, and I hate using this because we hear this word a lot today, this exponential growth from the 1970s on. So now, a couple of years ago, the closest estimate that I've seen was around 10 million NGOs are active worldwide and exist. And that is massive. Um, they're in a variety of different sectors. You'd be surprised, actually. Well, maybe you wouldn't be, but I think a lot of people would be surprised by how many of them are focused on global trade, about supply chain, manufacturing. They're more almost kind of offshoots of corporations than they are the way we think about NGOs traditionally, as helping feed the poor, helping spread medicine to areas that don't have it, or get clean water, or these sorts of very, I don't want to use the word noble, because that kind of maybe cheapens other endeavors that are also noble, but these kind of social causes, perhaps would be the best way to say it. But there's so many NGOs that are actually focused on global trade and the economic aspects of these things. Obviously, a lot focused on public health, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as it relates to the current pandemic, but then also a lot focused on human rights and other social causes. Okay, those are kind of the big sectors, but there's many, many more. And there's also a lot of very region and country specific NGOs. To say this is not an issue that we are trying to tackle broadly across the globe. This is an issue we are trying to solve in this particular region, in this city, in this county, in this state, in this province, in this locality, and maybe within a particular country or set of countries. But the scope of these NGOs varies significantly. So just to give you a sense of the growth sector that we see within the NGO world, as I say here, I have a couple of facts and figures. 3.3 million NGOs in India alone. Basically, one NGO for every about 400 people. It's absolutely stunning to see the growth there. Interestingly enough, we've seen the president of India really lean on these NGOs right now during the COVID-19 crisis. And so you've seen the real benefit of having this huge number of NGOs in India really kind of paying off a little bit for them right now for their own domestic politics. About 10% of the United States workforce is employed by NGOs, which is a huge percentage. And I think, again, people would be really shocked by that. The only two sectors that have more employment are in the manufacturing sector and retail sales. Those are the only two employment sectors that have a higher percentage of people in them than NGOs. So it's a huge workforce. It's a huge part of our workforce in the United States. Similarly, in a country like Australia, 8% of the workforce employed by NGOs. And then in Canada, you really see the impact of it. They don't have quite as many NGOs there, but there's a culture of giving to NGOs that is really overwhelming. And so 84% of Canadians donate to NGOs annually. Really pretty significant number. So money keeps rolling in, and I always like to use that phrase. It's one from one of my favorite musicals, Evita, and so and it's a song. The song is called "The Money Keeps Rolling In," but this I think goes to show you where so much money is being brought into this sector. And it's being brought into this sector largely by these huge philanthropic organizations. Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, the Ford Foundation, the Getty Trust. These are huge names in American corporations, international corporations, and they're contributing billions upon billions of dollars, trillions when you add all of this stuff together for these different causes. And so this is really what has also led to this huge explosion of NGOs. And what's interesting is that this kind of philanthropic tendency is something that Bill Gates in particular, I know this because I've read different articles about it, but has really tried in the last 20 years to go over to China and facilitate this sort of philanthropic work in the Chinese economy. That China started to have all of these billionaires as China's economy started to become more and more prevalent. China suddenly was producing more and more billionaires or extreme multimillionaires. But there wasn't a very strong philanthropic culture there. I mean, if you think about it, it makes sense. If you live in a country in which the government fulfills all of your social obligations and fulfills all of your basic needs, why would you feel the need to give? Okay, so there was a lot of outreach by American philanthropic forces to go over and spread that kind of philanthropy to the Chinese. And so that's what another thing you start to see so many Chinese NGOs really expand over the last 20 or 30 years. So it's really been quite stunning. So where does all of this funding come from, essentially? So well, it comes from a few different places, and it comes from really, I think, uh, three primary sectors. So where do NGOs get their money? They get them through three places. They get them through either government grants, through philanthropic organizations, or through small donors. Or if you have really good at hearing, you might also be hearing my dog Maya, who is protecting us from an unknown force right now, which is all likelihood another dog walking by our house. We have to be very safe during these times. Maya ensures quality social distancing. My wife is doing her best to wrangle her in, I think, right now. I'm sure this will not be the last time you hear Maya barking on one of these webinars. Nonetheless, these NGOs getting their funding from three different sources: government grants, philanthropists, small donors. So the government, it's interesting. You have these non-governmental organizations, and yet the government is where they're getting a huge amount of their money from. There are tons of government grants from different organizations and different offshoots of the government, from Health and Human Services to the Department of Defense to the National Science Foundation to the Humanities Alliance. All of these different government agencies, Housing and Urban Development, Department of Energy, all of these different organizations of the executive branch, essentially, that are constantly giving out funds to NGOs to be innovative in some cases or to fulfill different obligations and responsibilities. So those are, like I said, that's kind of where the government is coming from when they're funding NGOs. On the philanthropy side of things, you also get a lot of people who just give money to NGOs because they believe in a particular cause. Okay, so I'll give you an example of this. When I was in college, I interned at an organization called the Center for Education Reform. And the Center for Education Reform was located in Washington, D.C., and it was a nonprofit group, it was an advocacy group, but a nonprofit, an NGO in some capacity. And during that summer, I had a lot of responsibilities. One of the responsibilities that everybody kind of drew the short straw once a week was you had to essentially go through the mail and kind of do the basic administrative tasks, like answering the phone and opening the mail and distributing things and making copies and things like that. Luckily, it was only one day a week. There were four of us. Nobody did anything on Friday, but Monday through Thursday, one of us helped out with that. But then the other 4 days of the week, we actually got to do really cool substantive research in our internship. So it's a great experience. But I'll never forget one particular day when I was getting the mail and distributing it, and it was there was a letter, and I kind of opened it up because I didn't know who it was supposed to go to. And I opened up the letter, and it was a check. And it was a check from the Walton Foundation. And many of you already probably know who the Walton Foundation is. That's the family that owns Walmart. Okay, the Walton Foundation had written a check for the to the Center for Education Reform for $250,000. Okay, that was the most money I've ever held in my hand at one time. It still is. I immediately gave it to someone else to keep any temptation of fraud from my mind. But that's a great example of how these organizations fund, or how these philanthropic organizations fund these NGOs. So to give you some context, you go, well, $250,000, that's a lot of money, certainly, but it's not, a huge amount of money. Well, but it is. These NGOs, the Center for Education Reform, where I worked, they had 8 full-time employees, 4 interns, and had kind of a small office space in Washington, D.C. $250,000 back in 2000, 2001, $250,000 paid for probably 4 people's salary, 3 people, I mean, easily 3 people, if not 4 people's salary. So if you were to get 3 or 4 of those checks for the year, right? If you got, the Walton Foundation is giving you a little bit, Bill and Melinda Gates are giving you a little bit, you find these different philanthropic organizations all giving a little bit of money here and there. Little bit, I say, for them a little bit, but giving money here and there, suddenly that's a whole lot of money. So, and that funds everything you need for the whole year. So that's how a lot of these NGOs exist. And then you have some that really do rely on small donors. That $50 donations, $25 donations really are the bread and butter of these types of organizations. Something like Amnesty International is probably a really good example of that. Okay. So, big idea for this week as it relates to the NGOs. NGOs have some problems. NGOs are overwhelmingly trying to do the right thing. They're trying to do the right and good thing on a lot of different issues, but they face a lot of different challenges. One of those challenges is they're too ideological. They tend to be too focused on a particular ideology and approach. And that blinds them to other joint venture ideas. Because they're ideological, they tend not to collaborate with other organizations as much as they probably should. It also potentially cuts off or limits the amount of funding that they are being able to receive from different agencies. Okay, so those are the real challenges that you face when you're an NGO, is that you become maybe a little too ideological, and you kind of, maybe cut off your nose to spite your face, and it becomes a bit of a problem there. They're also very small. A lot of these organizations are 3, 4, 5, 8, 10 people. Okay, 10 million NGOs, yes, but most of those NGOs are just a couple of people working together on a particular cause that they care about. They're not these organizations that employ dozens of people doing a variety of different tasks. Okay, they tend to be very, very small enterprises and attempts at creating these types of organizations. So very small, underskilled. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean is that they don't have um, great skills many times in areas outside of what they're passionate about. Okay, so somebody creates an NGO around education. They know a lot about education. They know a lot about researching education and how education works. They don't really understand necessarily government that well. They don't necessarily understand um, other factors that might influence education. Okay, they might not understand certain economic consequences. They might not understand certain cultural issues that might affect different populations that they're working with. Um, and this, when you combine that with that ideological bent, means that a lot of times you get people trying to earnestly do the right thing, but they're too kind of blinded, and they have their kind of blinders on ideologically and from a standpoint of skills, that they have a very limited set of skills and they have a very limited ideology, and that prevents them from maybe seeing the big picture in the way that would be more beneficial to their organization. Okay, and that is going to come out with a couple of examples I'm going to give you in a second. But like I said, that underskilled, these are people who are good at, certain things and have certain areas of specialty, but you get outside of that just a little bit and they don't really understand other aspects of these issues that might actually be beneficial to them in the long term. They also lack coordination. This is something I mentioned earlier. A lot of NGOs are just lone wolves, okay? They're just out there doing their own thing, not paying any attention to what anybody else is doing. And because, again, going back to ideological, they have their blinders on, they're doing it their way because they want to do it this way. And they're not thinking about, how can I collaborate with these other NGOs? Because the NGO sector is very competitive. So they're all competing for the same grants. They're all competing for money from the same philanthropic organizations. And so the idea of collaboration is something that doesn't come around very often because it might actually hurt your organization a little bit. So it's also important to understand that not all NGOs are actually in the field doing things. That's, I think, again, a real misconception. Most, well, I shouldn't say most, a lot of NGOs are really extended lobbying organizations that are passionate about a particular cause and are really just lobbying Congress people, elected officials, government agencies to do the things that they want to see done. Okay, they're not actually out in the field helping people. They're not testing water. They're not testing air pollution. They're not, distributing medical supplies or anything like that. That's not to take away from those organizations, but that's simply, again, when we think of NGOs, we think of people out in the field helping people actively. And a lot of NGOs are not doing that. A lot of NGOs are sitting behind a computer, sending briefs, sending policy recommendations, sending portions of a bill, and so actual legislation, text to different governmental agencies, different government stakeholders, that sort of thing. And then a lot of it's also virtual campaigning now too. So again, not as much of it is out in the field that we might stereotypically think about as it relates to NGOs. So related to COVID-19, listen, NGOs are smaller, they're more flexible, they're able to shift in the time of a crisis in the way that these big, kind of corporations sometimes cannot, in the ways that government sometimes cannot. It takes a long time for government to make these shifts in some cases. NGOs, because they're smaller, they have fewer people, they can kind of go from one project to another project very, very quickly. The problem is that they're not really that well positioned to change sectors. What do I mean by that? Well, in the as in the situation right now with COVID-19, NGOs are not well positioned to go from an education to a public health NGO. Okay, that's what I mean. Those NGOs that are already in the public health sphere, great. They're able to address these problems. The NGOs that are literally everywhere else are not really that well positioned. Again, goes back to being very ideological, underskilled. They're focused on one issue. They're focused on a set of two or three issues, but they don't have the capacity to suddenly go, we're going to become a global health issue. We're going to become a global health organization. It's just not going to happen. Okay. Um, Also, a lot of these NGOs are smaller. As I say, your limited manufacturing supply chain experience. This goes back to, again, underskilled, understanding how do we scale up production of something? How do we get that distributed to a more global audience? These are really complex problems, and you need to have people who are specialists in supply chain management to really kind of talk through how that's going to work. And if you're an NGO with 5 or 6 people, you probably don't have somebody who is a supply chain specialist. So you might be well positioned to help with COVID 19, but you don't have the capacity, you don't have the expertise to scale up and really make those innovations where they need to be. This is where the big brands come in. This is where the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundations of the world really kind of take hold because they have the resources, they have so many people working for them that they're able to easily kind of go, okay, we're going to put all of our funding now behind this. And they're able to reposition themselves pretty quickly. They have the expertise, they understand how to work this sort of stuff through. They've been working globally for a long time. And this is where the big brand NGOs really kind of shine. That said, smaller private or smaller public health NGOs have a real opportunity for innovation here. Innovation that will likely get picked up by the big brand NGOs later on. But that's, like I said, I think that's really where their focus can be. So, what are the results? Well, NGOs can create a lot of change, but it's often very symbolic and it's often at the more local levels. Okay, that's really where we see NGOs being the most effective, getting small incremental change. Some of it symbolic, some of it actually really substantive. Um, but a lot of times at the more regional level, you don't see NGOs doing a ton of global work. It's a handful, right? It's the ones that you probably can rattle off the top of your head, right? Doctors Without Borders, BRAC, um, the Clinton Health Initiative, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Sure, we can all name a few of those, but there's 20, maybe 30 of those, and that's about it. The other 9.99 million are much smaller and are really focused at this much more regional level. Okay. So, number of NGOs creates coordination challenges. Because, like I said, there's so many different uh, NGOs that are competing for a limited amount of resources. That coordination often um, it kind of gets in the way of them being able to get the most amount of money. Okay, if you go, well, something, we're just going to partner with this other group. Well, then suddenly that other group looks a lot more important, and they're able to get the more funding. And now your group is hurting because you kind of took a back seat to somebody else's group. And those are the sort of competitive environment that NGOs exist within. Um, NGOs are very effective when specializing, when focusing. And I say that because NGOs, a lot of times, if they're focused on that local regional level, uh, that's where they can be effective. they can get actual change done at the local level. All right. It's when you try to scale those NGOs up very quickly, very rapidly, like in the time of a pandemic, that's when you face these overwhelming challenges. But if you are sitting there and going, listen, I'm an NGO and I'm focused on cleaner water in Austin, Texas, you can make a difference doing that. You can absolutely make a difference doing that in Austin, Texas. But if you try to say, I'm going to do this for the whole state of Texas, I'm going to do this for the whole Southwest, now you're starting to run into some larger problems because this is requiring more interaction with different government agencies, requiring more resources, requiring more expertise, requiring more people. It gets more and more complicated. But NGOs are very, very effective when trying to solve problems at the local level. But like I said, big brands overwhelm the market. They overwhelm funding opportunities because the government knows if we give our money to Bill and Melinda Gates for a particular initiative, or if we give our money to these other organizations that are very well known within these different sectors, they're going to get the job done because they have the resources and the capacity to do it. If I started an NGO, I don't think the government would necessarily be falling over themselves to give me money because what have I ever proven? How have I ever demonstrated the capacity to do these things? This is kind of the catch-22 that a lot of these smaller NGOs are in. They're small, so they don't have the capacity, but nobody's giving them a chance to demonstrate that capacity. And that's a challenge for sure. So wrapping up, what are we looking at this week? Well, I want you to review the material under the NGO section. And I'm going to still post an interview that I'm going to do with my friend Joe. So my friend Joe is the Senior Policy Director at the NGO One, which is kind of a World Health NGO. And so Joe and I are actually going to have a teleconference or I guess a webinar conference on Tuesday evening. And so I will be posting that on Wednesday. And so I'm going to be kind of posing as you in the webinar and the Zoom meeting by asking questions to Joe about how he got involved in the NGO sector, how you as students might be able to best get involved, what skills are most important, what type of work does he do, and to pass along his contact information to all of you. I know we weren't able to do these types of interviews as maybe interactively as I would like, but Joe's going to be the first person. I think I'm also going to be able to get my former student Arturo to do a Zoom meeting with me as well that I'll post so that, again, you can just kind of hear from people who are practitioners, get their contact information, learn a little bit more about that particular sector, see if it's something that you're interested in, and we can move on from there. Okay. UNESCO World Heritage Challenge coming at you again on Wednesday. Make sure to don't use the search function to try to guess the location, but I'll be posting that on Wednesday. And you can feel free to continue to post pictures of yourself at different UNESCO World Heritage sites. And then your assignments for this week are both due on Tuesday, the 14th. Okay, after Easter, your country analysis paper is due, as well as the NGO discussion thread. Do that Tuesday as well. Okay, so I hope all of you are doing well, and I wish you all the best. And until next time, I will see you again. Take care.